Welcome to the HerbWorks podcast featuring Roger Drummer, the formulator at herbworks.com. An educator in the field of nutrition and Chinese herbalism, Roger has a unique ability to keep things simple by taking all the guesswork out of complicated health issues. HerbWorks is committed to helping you improve your health and enhance your life through herbs and common sense.
Hello, it's Roger Drummer with another HerbWorks podcast, and today I'm going to be talking about the speed molecule. Not the illegal speed molecule, but the speed molecule in your brain. What is responsible for how fast your brain works, how fast you process information, how fast you lay down memories. It's all related to the speed molecule, and you have the ability to influence that every single time you eat or every single time you take a supplement. So today we're going to be talking about what that speed molecule is, how to influence it, all about how your brain cells don't actually age unless you're doing something yourself to age them, and how you can actually make new brain cells. And so all of that's covered today, but I want to start out by talking about this speed molecule. And the reason is that this is something I've been talking about for years, but now there's new research that has come out that shows how important this is. And so I'm going to kind of just go back over it and emphasize how important it is that you pay attention to building this speed molecule every single day. So I don't want to make you wait too long to find out what that is. So today what we're really going to start out talking about is something called acetylcholine. Now you may have heard of that. It's one of the 4 major neurotransmitters in your brain. And by major, I mean that there's 4 dominant ones that kind of set up your brain, and most people have a dominant neurotransmitter. One of these 4 types are what your brain either kind of runs your brain or your brain falls back on as a defense mechanism, but it's the main one that operates your particular brain style. Then there's dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA, and serotonin. Now everybody knows serotonin. It's the happy molecule. It's the calming molecule. GABA works pretty much the same way. It's a calming influence on your brain. And dopamine is the one that powers up your brain. So it's kind of like starting up your car. If you have good dopamine, it's like turning on your brain every morning. And we've had podcasts about dopamine and how, getting rid of sugar cravings and all this stuff influences the dopamine in your brain. But the speed molecule is what I want to talk about today, and that is acetylcholine. And the reason for that is that throughout history, acetylcholine, in fact, recent history, has shown that this is probably one of the most important neurotransmitters in your brain. And the reason they say that is because it has so much to do with your memory. So they call it the speed molecule because acetylcholine determines how fast you process information. It also determines whether you're able to grasp memories and lay down memories. It along with dopamine, helps activate the frontal lobe of your brain. And so if you're doing complex mental tasks, you ought to have enough acetylcholine. If not, you may be one of those people that's in their 50s and you think that you can't keep up with work because you just don't understand computers, or you just can't keep up with what's going on. A lot of times it doesn't have anything to do with your age. That has to do with whether you've been feeding your brain properly. And a lot of times it means that you're just not making acetylcholine the way you actually should. And so there's many ways through your diet and through supplementation that you can influence acetylcholine. In fact, I make my flagship product, which is called Tianqi, which is an anti-stress and brain essentials drink. And one of the main focuses of that drink is building acetylcholine. And that's because I realize that most people are stressed out and they can't keep up with work, and they got to speed up the way that their brain processes information. And so Oftentimes, it's the combination of inflammation and not enough nutrients that really does the double whammy on your brain. Because when you don't have enough nutrients, and in this case, enough nutrients like choline or DMAE and the B vitamins to help you process it, you don't have healthy nerves. And if you don't have healthy nerves, you're not going to make enough acetylcholine, and those nerves aren't going to be able to actually transmit or communicate with each other in your brain because your nerves are unhealthy to begin with. And if they're undernourished and you don't have the right amount of B vitamins to go with it, then your brain tends to get inflamed, or anything that causes inflammation in your brain tends to run rampant because you don't have the nutrition there to run the processes by which your brain uses to clear out inflammation. So it's kind of this vicious circle that you get wrapped up in. But acetylcholine is something that, back in the 90s, it was declared by the National Institute of Health that the number one threat when it comes to whether you're going to get dementia or Alzheimer's has to do with your body's level of acetylcholine. How active is your acetylcholine? And the reason they said this was because acetylcholine tends to be deficient in everybody that has dementia and Alzheimer's. In fact, all the drugs that they put out for Alzheimer's today are drugs that influence acetylcholine. So what they're really classified as are something called an acetylcholine stearase inhibitor, because that's the name of a chemical your brain produces to clear excess acetylcholine out of your brain. But nobody has excess acetylcholine in their brain. But the reason they get rid of that molecule is they don't want to take any acetylcholine that you have going on out of your brain prematurely. So they're hoping that it raises your level of acetylcholine. What always fascinates me is that they don't recommend anything in your diet to make sure you're getting enough of the nutrients to make acetylcholine, and they don't recommend that you take anything to influence how much acetylcholine you actually produce, which I find really fascinating and stupid at the same time. And so today I want to talk a little bit about that. And one of the main things you actually have to have, you must actually have this in your diet, is a nutrient called choline. Now, it isn't surprising with all this research coming out in the 90s about acetylcholine and how important it is. It isn't surprising to know that we're having problems with this because depending on who's doing the estimates, almost 75 to 90%, depending on the study, of the people in the United States have a choline deficiency, meaning that their diet doesn't supply them with the basic amounts of choline needed to make adequate amounts of acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter in their brain.
This podcast is brought to you by Herbworks, specializing in stress and brain essentials. Check out Roger's other articles and videos at herbworks.com. While you're there, take a look at our natural herbal-based product line for energy, stress, immunity, and sleep. Now back to Roger.
So it would almost stand to reason, because we're so highly stressed and we're exposed to so many chemicals, both of those things which cause more inflammation in your brain. And inflammation, by the way, we all know destroys nerve cells in your brain. And then at the same time, we have a lack of the main nutrient that helps our brain speed up processing, but it's also the main nutrient, this choline, that's used to make healthy nerves. So in other words, if your nerves, the neurons in your brain, are becoming inflamed and they're being attacked and they're being destroyed, if you don't have enough of the nutrient needed to actually build that and keep it strong, then it's going to be easier to wipe out those neurons, and they're just not going to be able to regenerate. And regeneration is something that is now been shown in the last 10 years to be completely true and can happen for anybody. It's called plasticity. Your brain can rewire itself depending on its experiences, but also on the amount of nutrition you have in your system and whether you get rid of all the things that cause it to actually break down your neurons and cause all this inflammation that's disrupting your brain function. And so we now know that if you have the building blocks, you can actually influence the health of the nerves in your brain. Now, again, this is something that I just don't understand why modern medicine doesn't help or have anybody pay attention to the amount of nutrients in their diet and supplementing something to help their brain when they obviously have an issue or a problem with their system that breaks down the nerves in their brain. One that comes to mind is MS. MS is a highly inflammatory autoimmune condition that attacks, where the body attacks its own neurons in the brain and starts stripping away the myelin sheath. Well, you would think if that's happening in your system, that you would want to do everything that you possibly could do to lower your inflammation and to take in the nutrients that your body would actually use to protect those neurons and to protect that myelin sheath, and yet nobody recommends it. And in this case, high-quality B vitamins like methylfolate, methylcobalamin, which is B12 in its methyl form, so your body actually utilizes it, niacin, pantothenic acid, choline. All these things are used by your body to make healthy neurons and maintain healthy nerves. So if you're under attack, you would think that if you had some of that in your diet, it would just be beneficial, right? And then the other thing you would need to do, if I was putting someone on a program, would be to deal with your stressors. Because stress, elevated cortisol, which is the stress hormone, elevated cortisol causes inflammation in your brain, and it's one of the main things or the main reasons why your hippocampus, which is like the memory center of your brain, is under attack from inflammation because of raised cortisol. So if you're in a chronic state of stress and you're producing way too much of this stress hormone and your brain becomes inflamed right along with having an autoimmune condition, it's probably just like a gasoline fire in your brain. So even though dealing with your stressors doesn't get rid of your autoimmune condition, what you're doing is removing some of the major inflammatory chemicals that might drive that process. And this is a unique way that they look at these things in the health field, although they don't look at them this way in the medical field, which is baffling to me. But it's one of the processes I used when I had cancer. I looked at the fact that stress causes an excessive amount of inflammation. Stress also, inflammatory chemicals caused by stress drive the other inflammatory markers in your body to go up, and inflammatory markers drive the replication of cancer cells. So if I could become less stressed and lower my inflammation and take herbs that worked on inflammatory markers in my body, then I would be doing myself a great benefit. And as you all know, if you've listened to this podcast, I actually was able to get over my cancer and cure it. I have now been 2 years cancer-free since I had that episode, and basically did it at home with a ketogenic diet and anti-inflammatory herbs and a new meditation that I adopted. So I know that that same process can be applied to other things, and in this case, like to your brain. Because again, most brain damage is driven by a couple of basic things: lack of nutrients and too much inflammation. Inflammation is usually driven by, unless it's unusual circumstances like an infection or something else, it's driven by your body's own production of stress hormone, and when it becomes excessive, that drives inflammation in your brain. Changes the whole way that your blood-brain barrier protects your brain from outside influences. So this stress has a major impact on brain function, and again, when you combine that with something that, like not enough nutrients, which most people are suffering from, then you're putting yourself in a position to have lower brain function and to sustain the type of long-term damage that catches up with you when you're in your 50s and your 60s. So, and one of those great examples again of that is acetylcholine production. Most Americans are very, very deficient in choline And it's surprising. I tell this to people all the time. It's fascinating to me that back in the 70s, when we didn't really have a lot of Alzheimer's. Do you remember being back in the 70s and having somebody talk to you about Alzheimer's or dementia? Didn't really even happen. It just wasn't around. I mean, you always had a relative that maybe was forgetful or something in your family, but it wasn't like it's a near epidemic issue today with health. It's nothing like it was back in the 70s. In fact, I remember back in the 70s, there was very few people that were fat or obese, somebody that you would consider to be really overweight. Sure, there was overweight people, but it was nothing like it is today, right? So I remember back in the 70s was right around the time where they discovered these new drugs to lower cholesterol. And everybody kind of went crazy on the low-fat diet and wanted to lower cholesterol. And they started taking these drugs to do that. And at that same time, it was like eggs became evil food. I talk to people even today that go, yeah, I love eggs. I'm allowed to have one of them a week. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, if I had to only eat a dozen a week, I'd just be suffering, right? And so the reason I bring this up is that it seems like this explosion of this memory-related disorder that could have something to do with the amount of choline in your diet started to really take hold when we started pushing a lifestyle that took the main source of choline out of our diet. And so people quit eating choline at the same time they were taking drugs to lower the amount of cholesterol that they make. And cholesterol is also essential to your brain function. It's one of the chemicals your brain uses to help communicate between neurons. And so all these things are kind of happening. Not to say that the lack of eggs in your diet causes your Alzheimer's, but it's one of those correlating factors to where we've reduced a certain nutrient, which had an adverse effect. We also maybe took a different drug, which lowered another substance in our body that they thought was good for our heart, that was lowering it was good for our heart, but that lowering it turned out to be bad for our brain. So it's all these different issues that kind of rolled up into one, but it really still comes back to what I talked about in the beginning, was the lack of nutrients, a lack of the building blocks to make something, in this case acetylcholine, and way too much stress, way too many inflammatory chemicals. And so this acetylcholine is actually used in every single nerve cell in your brain. Now think about that. You have about 100 billion brain cells. And every single one of those cells is dependent on having some choline in your diet to stay healthy. Now why is that? Well, choline isn't just transformed into this chemical acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. It's used to build new nerves. It's used to build that myelin sheath. It's used to make the membrane of every cell in your brain. So it's used by every brain cell that you have. And it's actually a nutrient that's been said to recharge your brain cells. So the only way that you could classify something as a nutrient that recharges your cells is to know that it's something that's essential for the healthy function of every cell in your body, and it's particularly your brain. So when I think of acetylcholine, and this is the reason I put choline in my formula Tianqi, is because I wanted to increase the speed by which people's brains worked. Because the number one thing that I got from all my friends, and you know what, I was in my 50s at the time I formulated this product. Number one thing I got from all my friends was that they had trouble keeping up. It seemed like they were too slow to process information. They couldn't keep up with how the world was changing, all these different things. And that really comes back with the speed by which your brain processes information. So it all comes back to the speed by which your brain processes inflammation. And so I didn't want to just settle for doing that whole process of building acetylcholine in your brain by using choline. So I went a little step further and added this nutrient called DMAE, which they call it DMAE because it's really called dimethylaminoethanol, and nobody wants to pronounce that. And so, but that's a nutrient that actually even crosses your blood-brain barrier better than choline, and it's used by your brain to make acetylcholine. And so by combining the two, what you have is a formula for people, especially because there's a lot of people that just don't process choline real well, and they have some issue going on with their genetics or something, so they're not a real highly functioning as far as absorbing choline, but they don't usually have a problem with DMAE. So DMAE is taken up by your brain much easier than choline, and it's made into acetylcholine quite rapidly. So it's a great little nutrient to add in, and again, it's also a nutrient just like the choline in your diet or in a formula like Tianchi that works synergistically with niacin, pantothenic acid, methylfolate, and methylcobalamin to actually repair and build acetylcholine in your brain. To go through every process by which your brain needs choline, it can utilize all these nutrients to keep your myelin sheath healthy, to regenerate the myelin sheath, to protect it, to get rid of inflammation, to deal with actually this whole process of regeneration of nerve cells in your brain. So if you're out there doing some exercise and you're getting some mental exercise, but also physical exercise, which helps stimulate the process and growth of new neurons, you still have to have these nutrients available to finish the process. You know, I love this focus we have now on exercise and everybody doing exercise and lifting weights to help their brain function, but that is pretty much not going to happen if you don't have the chemicals or the nutrients in this case there for your brain to go through the process to actually complete the task. Acetylcholine is probably for the average person, because we're so deficient in all these nutrients, the main thing you want to focus on when you first start getting into rebuilding your brain. There's looking at how much choline you get out of your diet and how much you actually want to supplement with on a daily basis. And believe me, for the average person, the average person would need to eat probably 5 or 6 eggs to come close to the amount of choline they need in their diet every single day. And let's face it, most people are not going to actually do that. They want to get an outside source. They want to take some choline, and the mistake that most people do, they go out and find either lecithin or they find choline in a capsule, and it really doesn't have the nutrients with it, so your body can actually utilize it. And this is again why I came up with pretty much the brain formula part of Tianchi. I wanted to have not only all the B vitamins, the pantothenic acid, the niacin, the B12, and the folic acid in the forms that your brain can actually utilize. And that's really important, especially with folic acid and B12. It has to be the methylated form, or your nervous system doesn't take it up and utilize it immediately. And for a lot of people with genetic issues, they just don't utilize it at all. And so besides having that in the form that you actually need it, you have to have it in the right dosing, and you have to have it together so it's there when your body wants to actually produce it and use it. And so this is what led me to come up with my formula Tianchi, and how it's transformed itself over all these years from just a great anti-stress formula to now a brain formula, and then every couple of years I keep adding to it and changing it to keep up with the new research. And so it falls right into that line of how you're going to work on the two main things that you need to work on for anybody that wants to improve their memory and how their brain works. You look at anti-stress, lowers inflammation, and then you look at the nutrients needed to produce acetylcholine so that their brain is processing information at a high rate, at the rate it needs to actually keep up in the world and to complete their task at work and not get overwhelmed. And this is a fascinating thing. I've found this out in my own herbal practice the last 5 or 6 years, and I find it to be very fascinating. And that issue is that I talk to a lot of people that tend to be depressed. And I find that most of them are usually medicating, and they're over-medicating with things from the health food store to calm them down. And by over-medicating, what I'm saying is that what I found with quite a few individuals was that they were taking so many things to build serotonin and to calm them down for their anxiety and their stress that they were causing themselves anxiety and stress. And for a certain number of individuals, what I found was that the source of their anxiety and stress was the fact that their brain was functioning too slow. And now they were taking a medication and a bunch of herbs that they were self-medicating with that were all designed to slow them down and slow down their brain, and they were becoming more anxious and more stressed out. I found this very fascinating, and it kind of falls into that category of not really having a professional figure out what's really going on. And that doesn't just happen with trying things in a health food store. A lot of times when you get a medication, especially for something for depression or of that nature, no one's really analyzing your brain. No one's actually testing it to find out what's going on. They just throw a serotonin uptake inhibitor at you, and sometimes it's just not what you need. And so I found out just kind of through my own experimentation that a lot of people were stressed out because their brain was functioning too slow. And when you gave them just basic nutrients that allowed their brain to process information more readily, they felt better. A lot of their stress went away because it brought them back up to a normal level of function for their brain. It's not like you become a hyper-speed computer walking down the street when you take things that build acetylcholine. No, your body actually just brings itself up to its normal optimum level of acetylcholine. And for a lot of people, that can just feel like magic when it happens because they've been so slow for so long that they just aren't even familiar with the feeling of being able to process information. So that was one of the things I learned through this whole process of building Tianqi and talking to thousands of people about it, was that this formula that just looked at their brain as something that was deficient in nutrients, that if I could make an impact on the amount of essential things that your brain needed to keep up, that it would be life-changing for most people. And that's basically what happened. So, and I didn't just do that with the nutrient portion of this formula, even though I focused on two things, dopamine and acetylcholine. The dopamine in my formula is actually controlled by the amount of tyrosine in it and the herb rhodiola. Rhodiola is a fascinating herb in the fact that it actually builds a chemical, dopamine, that powers up your brain and at the same time builds a chemical, serotonin, that calms your brain. And so that's truly, in my mind, it's like a true adaptogen. It gives your body what it needs at the moment that it actually needs it. So your brain can go into a power up mode or to a calm down mode at any time because rhodiola is changing the way your brain communicates with each other. And this is something I talk about all the time with brain coherence, in the fact that you have an adaptogenic formula that lowers your stress, which automatically lowers your inflammation in your brain. But at the same time, because it works on your pituitary, your hypothalamus, your pineal gland, it works on the centers of your brain that actually control major portions of your brain. This is something that is really not looked at in Western medicine, is the fact that your glands in your brain control certain parts of your brain. And by control, I mean they energize that particular area of your brain. So if you're always stressed out, if your brain drops down into fight or flight, basically that means the energy of the frontal lobe and the top of your head is pretty much shut off, because those glands have shut off. The main dominant energy of your brain is survival and fight or flight. And so that shuts off access to other parts of your brain. And so your brain's not communicating anymore. And so when you go into taking an herbal formula like the herbal part of Tianqi, now you've increased the activity of your entire brain, and it starts to communicate with each other. And then at the same time, you add this nutrient base, then your brain just kind of lights up because it's relaxed enough to actually turn on all the parts of your brain, and now you have the nutrition available for all those parts of your brain to actually activate and to light up. And that's really the magic of Tianqi. So it's the adaptogenic herbs combined with the nutrients that has this major effect of supporting your entire brain function. Now, there's other things in the product that actually, support brain function. You would think that those are the only things, the ones that I mentioned, that actually do something for your brain. But I'll tell you, every single nutrient in that particular product, whether it's herbs or a nutrient, is in there because of its influence on brain activity. In fact, there's one in there that hardly anybody ever talks about. It used to be a huge nutrient back in the 80s and 90s when it first hit this country, and it's called dimethylglycine. And I've had dimethylglycine in that formula from day one, because back in the 80s when I used to be a triathlete and used to hike in the mountains all the time, I took dimethylglycine every single day because it oxygenated my brain, and it just seemed to make me more alert, and I just felt like I had more power in my brain. And so surprisingly, what I found 15 years later or so when I started making this formula was that DMG has this amazing ability to power up your pituitary gland. It's almost like booting it up and powering up one of the main areas of your brain, and it's like your brain holds energy better with dimethylglycine. Now, there's a whole bunch of other processes that go on with this particular substance, but that's why I put it in Tianqi, because it seems to activate and synergistically work along with building dopamine and acetylcholine to highly energize the frontal lobe of your brain, where you make decisions, where your executive functioning is, where you feel pleasure. All these different things are part of what we talk about with frontal lobe activity, and DMG seems to power all of that up. And so what I want you to get out of this talk today is a few things. One is that you have to pay attention to what you feed your brain. You have to pay attention to this speed molecule in your brain, acetylcholine. You want to have a diet that not only has choline in it, but you want to supplement. You want to take a great supplement, not only for your stress to lower inflammation, but something that gives you the building blocks to build acetylcholine. And then you also want to deal with your inflammation, which again comes back to stress, which is what I specialize in, and adaptogenic herbs are some of the best herbs that you could ever have in your system to lower how your body promotes its own inflammatory state, and that's through stress. Excessive stress hormone just aggravates every other process in your body that leads to inflammation. If you're exposed to chemicals or have toxins in your body that are causing inflammation, having excessive stress and elevated cortisol is just like adding gasoline to that. It just stokes the fire and makes it harder for your body to deal with the other issues of inflammation you have. The other thing I want you to realize is that your body needs nutrition to not only run basic processes, but to protect itself from a lot of other issues going on in your system. In other words, it's not only the nutrients you need, in this case, choline and the B vitamins, to build healthy neurons in your brain, but you need it so those neurons don't age rapidly and get in an inflammatory state and then require your body to go through a process to try it and clear that out. And it surprisingly is the same things that would help your body run the processes to clear that out are the ones that you needed to maintain its health in the first place, which is the B vitamin group, the methylfolate, the methylcobalamin, the cholines, all these different nutrients. They're not only the food for your brain, they're protective chemicals for your brain. It's basically this whole idea of inflammation comes down to how well you're feeding your brain, how well you're actually taking care of yourself. And it's not just about taking one anti-inflammatory herb or nutrient into your system. You have to feed your brain to maintain it. And this is probably your best line of defense against aging, particularly aging of your brain, and losing this speed molecule that we require every single day to lay down memories, to access memories, and really just to keep up in life. So if you like this information, you can tune into more podcasts at herbworks.com. Thank you for tuning in.